They read it aloud, which surprised me. I had expected them to file it quietly, a clerical notation, the kind of procedural insult that lands in writing and lets both sides pretend it didn't happen in the room. Instead, Sub-Arbiter Orven stood at the curved rostrum of the Vareth Concord's Joint Treaty Commission and read the full text of the Procedural Irregularity Declaration into the record, his three-chambered voice carrying every syllable to the far tiers of the chamber. I was seated at the human delegation's table, fourth chair, left side, which was the position Earth's liaison corps assigned to the senior military attaché when the senior ambassador was present. Ambassador Lyra Thane sat at my left. She did not move when Orven began reading. She had her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the middle distance, which was the posture she used when she was listening to something she had already read. The declaration ran to 11 clauses. I know because I counted. The substance was this: Earth's delegation had submitted its credentials under Article 9 of the Vareth Accord, which governed the seating of full partner bodies. The Concord's Credentials Review Panel had determined, after 14 months of deliberation, that Earth did not meet the threshold for full partner status under the revised Annex 4 criteria adopted 18 months ago. Therefore, Earth's delegation was seated irregularly. Therefore, the Concord formally withdrew recognition of our delegation's standing in the current session. Therefore, if Earth wished to continue participating, it would need to submit a written acknowledgement of the procedural error, formally request reseating under provisional observer terms, and wait for the panel's confirmation before speaking again in session. Orven finished and set down the document. The chamber was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that a body produces when it is watching something it considers to be a foregone conclusion. Around the great curved table, the Concord's delegation leads were still. The Yathrani bloc had their characteristic flat expressions, the ones that communicated nothing but which I had learned, over 4 years at this table, communicated satisfaction. The Resivane pair at the far end had their optical clusters angled toward us, with a quality I can only describe as anticipation. The Keth Mercantile Authority's 3 representatives, the ones whose corridor this entire session was nominally about, sat with their ridge plates raised, which was the equivalent of leaning forward. Everyone in that room expected the next sound to be a human voice explaining itself. I want to be precise about what happened next, because people have told the story wrong for years, and the wrong version makes us sound either reckless or lucky, and we were neither. 2 days before the session, Thane had arranged a site visit to the commission wing under the standard pre-session access provision. I had accompanied her. We walked the entire chamber at the pace she chose, which was slow and thorough, the pace of an officer who had requested a room in advance and intended to use her time in it. She measured the distance from our delegation table to the main exit, using the heel-to-toe method she'd learned at her first posting. She noted the sightlines from the rostrum. She counted the rows of tiered seating in the observers' gallery. When we reached the door, she stood in the frame for a moment and looked back at the room, and I thought then that she was memorizing it. I understand now she was checking something else. Ambassador Thane uncapped her stylus, wrote one word on her notepad, and turned it so I could read it. The word was confirmed. I had understood that word to be coming since the morning briefing 3 days earlier, when our legal attaché, Davin Solis, had walked us through the Annex 4 revision language with a calm that only a man who has found something genuinely useful manages to produce. But seeing it written in Thane's hand, in that chamber, steadied something in me that I had not known needed steadying. She capped the stylus. She gathered the 3 documents in front of her, the session agenda, the delegation's formal credential submission, and the Concord's own copy of the Vareth Accord, and stacked them in a single neat pile. Then she stood up. She did not speak. She did not look at Orven, or at the Yathrani bloc, or at the Keth Mercantile Authority. She picked up the document stack, pushed her chair in, and walked toward the chamber's main exit at a pace that was not hurried and not theatrical, the pace of a person who had somewhere else to be. I followed her. So did Solis, and our 2 junior aides. 5 humans, walking out of the Vareth Concord's Joint Treaty Commission in a line, in silence, while 600 delegates and staff watched. I did look back, once, just before the door. I am not ashamed of it. I wanted to see the room at that moment, and I am glad I did. Sub-Arbiter Orven was still at the rostrum. His declaration had been designed to produce a response, an objection, an appeal, a request for clarification, a written apology, any of the gestures that would have confirmed Earth's subordinate position and given the Concord the procedural record it wanted. He had not been designed, by temperament or by training, to receive silence and a closed door. He had one hand on the rostrum's edge, and he was looking at the document he had just read, as though it might offer some instruction. Behind him, one of the senior Concord recorders had paused with his stylus raised, and I could see him scanning back through whatever record he was keeping, reading something twice. The Keth Mercantile Authority's 3 representatives were no longer leaning forward. Their ridge plates were flat, and the one in the center, their legal counsel, I learned later, had turned away from our table entirely and was speaking in a low, rapid register to the aide sitting behind him. I stepped through the door. The corridor outside the commission chamber was wide and pale and empty, lit from above by the Concord's institutional lighting. Thane walked to the end of it and stopped at the viewport that looked out over the station's docking ring. I stood beside her. Solus and the aides stayed a few steps back, which was the correct instinct. 40 minutes, Thane said. It was the first thing any of us had spoken since entering the chamber that morning. She meant the clause. Specifically, she meant Article 31 of the Vareth Accord, subsection G, paragraph 4, which governed what happened to the transit corridor access restrictions when a signatory delegation withdrew from an active session without filing a counter-petition. The clause had been drafted by the Keth Mercantile Authority itself, 22 years ago, as a mechanism to freeze out smaller bodies that might try to disrupt proceedings by walking out. A punitive withdrawal provision that was supposed to guarantee the Keth corridor stayed closed to anyone who left the table in bad standing. The Concord had used it as a weapon 17 times. Every previous target had filed a counter-petition within the session window. Every previous target had, in some form, come back. The Concord had built an institution on the assumption that no one would walk away from a seat at this table and mean it. The Concord's credentials review panel had made one miscalculation, and Davin Solus had found it 3 weeks before this session. He had been cross-referencing the withdrawal provision against the corridor exclusion language for a different purpose entirely, building a counter-petition strategy in the event the declaration was filed, when he noticed that the clause's operative mechanism and its stated consequence did not align. He had read it 4 times before he said anything to Thane, and when he did, he said it the way a man says something he wants to make sure he has right. Slowly, with the document open in front of him, pointing to each operative phrase in sequence. The withdrawal without counter-petition clause did not specify the direction of the access restriction. It froze corridor access to the withdrawing party, but it did so by removing the party from the Accord's signatory register for the duration of the session freeze. And a party removed from the signatory register was not subject to the Accord's exclusion zones. The Keth Transit Corridor had been closed to Earth under Article 12 of the Vareth Accord, which only applied to registered signatories. When we walked out the door without filing a counter-petition, Earth stopped being a registered signatory. Article 12 stopped applying. The corridor opened. Thane had asked Admiral Sen Vorath to have the Survey Commerce Fleet positioned at the Keth Corridor's outer marker 36 hours before this session. Not inside the corridor, not in any space that could be construed as a provocation before the session concluded. Just outside the marker, in open transit space, where they had every right to be, waiting. 40 minutes was a conservative estimate of how long it would take the Concord's legal staff to work through what had just happened. Solus had run the calculation twice. He had given Thane a window of 35 to 50 minutes, and she had given Vorath 40, because she was the kind of person who left herself a margin and never mentioned it. I watched the docking ring below the viewport. Cargo loaders moved on their programmed paths. A Resivane light tender was cycling through its docking sequence with the mechanical patience of a machine that had done this 10,000 times. Nothing about the station looked like a moment that would be discussed for the next 30 years. Did Orven know? I asked. I meant whether he had understood the legal consequence when he read the declaration. No, Thane said. He thought he was reading a reminder of our place. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the Keth knew. The Mercantile Authority's senior legal counsel filed an internal query about the withdrawal clause 6 months ago. We have the document. She paused. They decided the risk was acceptable. I thought about the Keth representative's ridge plates going flat, and the legal counsel turning to speak to his aide in a low, rapid register, and I decided that they had spent the last several minutes revising that assessment at some speed. The session was formally suspended 43 minutes later. The Concord's legal secretariat issued a technical hold, standard language for a situation in which the session record had produced consequences the presiding body needed to assess before continuing. It was, in the vocabulary of the Vareth Accord, a neutral administrative action. It meant, in practice, that 11 people in a sealed review chamber were reading Article 31, subsection G, paragraph 4, and then reading it again, and then asking someone else to read it. Admiral Vareth's fleet entered the Keth transit corridor at the 40-minute mark. I have never asked whether that was coincidence or coordination. Some things a liaison officer learns not to ask. The formal Concord protest was filed 18 hours later. It cited procedural irregularity, the same language Orvan had used against us, and requested Earth's delegation return to session to address the matter. The protest was delivered to Ambassador Thane's quarters on the station. She read it. She set it on the desk. She did not file a response. 3 weeks after that, the Vareth Concord's Credentials Review Panel issued a revised determination, under a re-examination of Earth's Article 9 credential submission, the same submission they had deliberated on for 14 months and found irregular. The panel found no procedural basis for the withdrawal of recognition. Earth's delegation was restored to full partner standing, effective immediately. No written acknowledgement was requested. No reseating under provisional observer terms was required. No apology was mentioned. I was present when the revised determination arrived. Thane read it at the small table in the delegation's working room, with the same flat table hands she had used in the commission chamber. When she finished, she set it aside and pulled the next document in her stack toward her, which was a joint transit framework proposal Solis had drafted for the first post-corridor session. I asked her once, later that year, what she had thought when she stood up from that table. She said she had thought about the walk. Specifically, she had thought about the distance from her chair to the door, 31 meters, which she had measured herself 2 days before, on the site visit. She had thought about keeping her pace even, and her hands steady on the documents, and not looking at the Yathrani block. And the rest of it? I asked. She considered for a moment. The rest of it was already done, she said. Walking out was just the last step of something we finished 3 weeks ago. She picked up the transit framework proposal and went back to work. That is the accurate account. I have given it here because the versions that circulate tend to describe what happened as a gamble, or an accident, or a bluff that came off. It was none of those things. It was preparation and patience, and the understanding that when someone hands you an open door and calls it an insult, the correct response is to walk through it. The Keth Transit Corridor has been open for 9 years. The Vareth Concord has never filed another procedural irregularity declaration. I am told Sub-Arbiter Orvan retired 2 years after the session. I have no information about the nature of his retirement, and I have not sought any. That is not the part of the story that matters. The part that matters is 31 meters, and a steady pace, and the door.